Hi everyone, welcome to session 21, Alternatives to Punishment. You'll note that there are only 2 slides to this session. It's a very short session. However, that does not necessarily mean that that's all the time we're going to be devoting to alternatives to punishment. And the fact of the matter is that throughout the rest of this particular course, and more importantly, through the rest of all of your courses that you're going to be taking towards your board certification, the idea of seeking alternatives to punishment and more general sense, seeking alternatives to using aversive control will be a central theme throughout all of the courses, because one of the things that becomes probably apparent in using the experimental analysis behavior is that there are many, many ways to change behaviors that may be challenging, that may be dangerous to a person or to other people, and that in those rare instances in which punishment might need to be used, many times there are so many alternatives to using punishment that you don't have to do that. A lot of times in our culture, using punishment is really a knee-jerk reaction. There are many reasons for that, and I think if you really want to learn more about why we always jump to the use of punishment, you'll probably get that from reading Beyond Freedom and Dignity, where Skinner covers this quite at length, and I would certainly refer you to that in terms of society's use of punishment and why we end up doing that very quickly rather than using some of these alternatives. Even though the science is very clear, the alternatives really work very well. And another book I would also recommend, I don't have it on the reading list as required reading, but it's a book by Murray Sidman called Coercion and Its Fallout. I'll sort of hold it up right here. This is what it looks like, Coercion and Its Fallout. And this is really, really an excellent book describing the history of our culture and many cultures in using punitive practices and why they continue and why it's detrimental in the long run to a society to base all of its cultural practices, or even many of its cultural practices, on coercive control. Again, Sidman, from the free operant avoidance research that we had talked about back in negative reinforcement, has covered this topic quite extensively. And in fact, we're going to be covering Sidman in another couple of sessions when we get to stimulus equivalence. Okay. Again, with the alternatives to punishment, I do want to point out here that when you step back and look at behavior, there are many reasons why people behave as they do, and the knee-jerk reaction to using punishment might be more understandable for people who need to control behavior and just don't know any other way to do so. And as perhaps ineffective as they do this, it continues to happen again and again. And we hope that by teaching how behavior works in terms of skill building and positive reinforcement, we're in a much better position to analyze the problematic behavior and hold back on using punishment and try some different sorts of things. Even just looking at the problem behavior. As I mentioned to you before, there are oftentimes a couple of scenarios that pop up. We find out, for example, that the person engages in a behavior, the reinforcer is pretty clear, but the problem is not really with the positive reinforcement that they're getting, it's a problem with the behavior. And perhaps if we taught an alternative behavior to getting that same reinforcer, there would be no reason to engage in the previous operant behavior, which is the one that is problematic. Again, how much time we spend teaching people alternatives, we need to take a look at that and improve how we do that, and so on. Another thing to look at here is we find out that the behavior that is challenging or problematic really, when you look at it closely, is not problematic in the strictest sense of the word. What happens here is that it occurs too often. And this is one of the things that I hear so often when I consult with parents and teachers, is that they'll say, oh my God, he's doing it all the time. It's driving me nuts. We need to get him to stop doing it. And a lot of times the things that they're doing actually happens to be something functional. It may be asking questions of teachers. It may be going to the bathroom. It may be doing other things. These end up being functional things, although they're more functional when they're at a lower rate. But when they occur at a higher and higher and higher rate, it starts to drive people around them crazy. So again, we look at the problem behavior, that it's not really dangerous. It's a rate problem. And people, as we know, will use punishment. Why? Because punishment decreases the rate of responding and the future probability. Although we know that there are many things that we could use to decrease rate of responding. Amongst those things is look at the schedule of reinforcement. That's a great way to look at things, and you find out that if all you have to do is alter the schedule of reinforcement, fantastic. We know how to do that. We've learned how to do that by going from variable ratio reinforcement to something which is a little bit easier to handle, maybe a lower variable interval schedule. It might actually be an IRT greater than T, what we call differential reinforcement of lower rates. And all of these things will alter the rate of responding without ever having to use an aversive event to do so. Again, these are very subtle techniques that usually are reserved to people who take applied behavior analysis or experimental analysis behavior. But once we start learning these techniques, we should be teaching them to folks, and we see that they will start picking up these techniques and generalization hopefully starts taking place. Again, these techniques are very, very important to consider in using as alternatives to punishment. Now, I'm going to go over very quickly, again, two techniques that are very common that you'll see in the literature. I mentioned these earlier in the schedule section. Actually, let me go ahead and freeze my face here. Hold on a sec. Okay, there we go. Okay. The first one is called the R bar equal to T. Let's say we have a problematic behavior like one person who hits another person. And that happens at a fairly frequency of, say, maybe once every 15 minutes, roughly, or once every 20 minutes. We might start off by providing positive praise and reinforcement for every 10 minutes that goes by in which the individual doesn't hit somebody else. Okay? So we would do that, and the first thing we want to do is if we're going to use a schedule like this, we need to take baseline. We absolutely got to find out what is the inter-response time between each physical aggression. Now, for starters, we don't oftentimes do that. In many settings, if we're looking at things such as physical aggression or disruptive behavior, we look at frequency. How often does it occur? But it becomes important for this particular schedule, not knowing only how often it occurs in terms of frequency, but also how much time occurs between each episode. That is, if you study this long enough, you may find that on the average, like I said, this person could go about 15 minutes without hitting people. What was the longest interval? Well, they went, in looking at 2 weeks, they went about, the longest they could go was about 20 minutes. Okay. What was the shortest? It might have actually been about 3 minutes or something like that. So we know that on the average, they could go roughly 15 minutes without hitting somebody. So you may actually want to start off by setting your DRO, instead of at 15 minutes, 10 minutes. That is, if they could go 10 minutes without hitting somebody, they will earn reinforcement in one form or another, whatever that might be that you come up with. It could be verbal praise. It could be something like conditioned reinforcement. Whatever that is, though, you know that if on the average he roughly could go 15 minutes, then you know they could probably go 10 minutes. That's where you start thinking about what is the proper value. You need to let the data tell you what is the proper T value in the R bar equal to T. And that's how we would actually do that. If you know that they go roughly 15 minutes and the longest they've been able to go is 20 minutes, then you really should not set your T value at 30 or 40 or 50 minutes. Why? The distribution shows you from past behaviors they were never able to go that long anyway. So that would be a poor starting point. So roughly we look at what is the mean inter-response time between these episodes, figure what that is, and then back up a little bit, just to kind of give yourself, as we call it, a little wiggle room. Okay? And again, we call these, you'll see this in the literature, as differential reinforcement of perhaps other behavior, right? Because in that 15-minute period that you say no hitting takes place, well, in that 15 minutes, they're not in a coma. They're still behaving, and they're doing other things. So what you might be reinforcing is whatever other behaviors they're doing in that 15 minutes gets reinforced. Okay? That's one way to look at it. Perhaps we also look at it as a differential reinforcing zero occurrence of behavior. Okay? Or the omission of behavior. Again, these are some of the ways in which we describe the term DRO. And we even call this omission training in the old literature. Remember here, one of the tricky things about this you got to be careful about is when we say in a contingency of, say, R bar equal to T. Again, no responding for time period T. And we're going to say, what's the R bar? No physical aggression. For what period? T, 15 minutes. Now, during that 15-minute period, it becomes our concern that we don't see any kind of hitting taking place. Okay? But in that other category, during that 15 minutes, they may not be hitting, but they're doing other things, and you got to be careful about that. In other words, they may not be hitting other people, but you find out that they're engaging in other inappropriate behavior, right? They weren't hitting, but they were actually perhaps going into somebody else's room or possessions and stealing something. That wasn't part of the contingency. The contingency said no hitting. Not no hitting and no stealing, but no hitting. And what happens here is that if this is not part of the contingency, after 15 minutes, they're going to get the delivery of a reinforcer, and you may actually inadvertently or accidentally reinforce other behaviors that you don't want to reinforce. Another danger here is that during that 15-minute period, they are actually not anywhere near other people. They end up staying in their room their entire time. And then 15 minutes is up, you walk up to the room and you say, good job not hitting other people, here's your reinforcer, nice work. And the problem here is that there was no opportunity to hit other people. Perhaps the house was empty. Or, again, they're in their room. What you end up reinforcing here, perhaps, is not necessarily not hitting other people. You may be inadvertently reinforcing isolation kinds of behaviors. So, again, these are the things to actually consider here in this process, that if you're really going to do a DRO or an R bar equal to T for not hitting, then that really should take place when there's opportunities to engage in the behavior, like when there's other people around. And when other people are around, now you have all of the discriminative stimuli that were present previously, which gave rise to hitting. Okay, so you need to make sure that when you're running this, all of the SDs that are in place are there so that an alternative behavior could be learned. In other words, you want the person to learn not to hit anytime, not just when the person is alone in their room. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Now here's one of the things that also happens on these fixed DROs, okay, or these fixed R bar equal to Ts. If you go 15 minutes, okay, and after 15 minutes you don't hit anybody, you get your reinforcer. Again, if the T value is 15 minutes, then you know that you're not going to get your next reinforcer for another 15 minutes, and then another 15 minutes, and then another 15 minutes. What you set up here is a very clear discriminative periodic schedule in which right after reinforcers delivered, you know that there's no opportunity to get any more reinforcement, at least for another 15 minutes. So in other words, you set up a very discriminable post-reinforcement time in which no reinforcers are actually available. Now, during that 15 minutes, what happens if you hit somebody? And this is something you're going to learn in later classes, how you respond when a physical aggression or a violation takes place. What happens to that interval? Now, there are several ways to doing this. Some of the ways in which you do this are called whole interval or momentary interval, DRO, and so forth and so on. You'll learn about these things. But the main thing here to realize is that at the very beginning, you set up an opportunity in which engaging in the right behavior will not be reinforced. That is, on a fixed DRO or a fixed R bar, right after the person gets a reinforcer for not engaging in a particular behavior, nothing's going to happen. There are no reinforcers. So in that sense, you've created an opportunity in which if the person went ahead and hit somebody, what's going to happen? What's the big deal? A lot of times if you have this interval just resetting, that might not be a very big deal, right? In other words, they have to go, say, 15 minutes without hitting somebody. After 1 minute, this person is bothering them. They hit the person. And you just reset that timer. So instead of 15 minutes between a reinforcer, now it's only actually 16 minutes because you had to reset it. That may be, again, worth it. What's the big deal? I could get this person, I could hit this person and get whatever reinforcement I get by doing that. And the only thing I lose is that one reinforcer. I add on 1 extra minute onto my schedule. Okay, so these are the variables to think about, that when you use this, you set up this condition, this post-reinforcement condition, in which what opportunities do I have for reinforcement? None. What advantage do I gain by going back to the alternative problematic behavior and getting some degree of reinforcement from doing that? Probably pretty favorable. Now, one thing that I've done over the years is to change a periodic reinforcement schedule such as this over to variable DRO, or variable R bar equal to T, in which I would say on the average, if we went back to the 15-minute interval, I would say on the average, every 15 minutes that passes and you don't hit somebody, you'll get a reinforcer. Now remember, that's on the average. Sometimes in the distribution, the R bar may actually be, 1 minute, maybe 30 seconds. It may be 15 minutes. It may be 25 minutes. In other words, instead of a fixed periodic one, I have a distribution of R bar variable intervals, okay? And what that does is it means that once a person receives a reinforcement on this schedule, because the probability is variable, then the next interval, even though it may be remote, it's in the probability, will actually be that it could be a short interval, all right? It may be a 5-second one. It may be a 1-minute one. It may be a 3-minute one. And just as variable schedules of reinforcement actually eliminate post-reinforcement pause by making that probability of reinforcement and no reinforcement situations discriminable, here you actually get rid of the discriminability. And you find that you lower the probability of what we call this post-reinforcement burst of inappropriate behavior that you might actually see, what we actually think might be something called adjunctive behavior. Okay, so I'm going to stop here at this point because these are the two big schedules that we typically use, at least in our practice. But in particular, we particularly like using variable DROs or variable R bars because it decreases the probability of what we call this burst of post-reinforcement target behaviors that may happen not because of something in the environment changing, but because the schedule of reinforcement is not favorable to reinforcing non-hitting behavior right after reinforcement is delivered. It's probably a long way to go about basically saying, here, just go ahead and make it variable. We recommend it. The other thing I would recommend, if you want to read a little bit more on variability in this stuff, in your book, in the Pearson-Cheney book, there's a section there in the conditioned reinforcement chapter. And you probably have already read it, but go back and read it where they talk about using variable conditioned reinforcers and the reason for doing so. It is an excellent, it's very short, I think it's a paragraph long, but I highly recommend getting used to using variability in your schedules of reinforcement. I also will tell you, get ready for people to be very resistant to using variable schedules of reinforcement. In my experience, because it seems somewhat foreign to what people end up doing, or perhaps a little bit more work, a lot of times parents and staff are resistant to using these kinds of schedules. They'd rather use fixed ones. On the other hand, once parents learn the reasons why you use this versus fixed, and that in the long run, the little bit that, on the front end, you have to learn a little bit how to use variable stuff, but in the long run, you're going to come away with fewer behaviors and easier to manage behaviors. Again, you could probably convince parents and staff to do this. All right, and I will see you